Okay, thanks everyone for joining. Really excited about this. I've got Mohammad Syed and Pedro Castillo here to help with this presentation. It's going to be a little bit different format than what we've typically done. I'm going to have the presentation slides that I'm going to go through, and we'll have the Q&A like typical after, but we've also got some question breaks in there to get Mohammad and Pedro's comments on things, and obviously guys, if you have anything that you want to interject while I'm saying things or even disagree with me, that is perfectly fine. Like, this is supposed to be us having a conversation with the community, right? I want this to be a resource for people. So I'm just going to keep it in this kind of mode because it's a little easier than sometimes Zoom goes crazy when we do full screen and stuff. So I'm going to keep it like this, and makes things a little bit more readable on the screen as well. But so with that, thank you, everyone. Mohammad, Pedro, why don't you give like a super brief intro to yourselves, just so that people know who you are and what's going on there.
Pedro, do you want to go first? Should I go first?
Yeah, please go first.
Yeah, okay. So I'm a management consultant. I work in the UK. If anyone's sort of joining us from overseas, I'm sure global community now. And really, I sort of specialize in data strategy management and architecture. And on the architecture point, I've been involved in a couple of data mesh implementations now. So kind of like seen rubber hit the road on these things from a couple of different perspectives. One in terms of delivering platforms, as in the actual like sort of Azure-based platforms, and then the second from more of a business perspective in terms of like architecting, how products should be built and how people should be organized and that sort of stuff. So, hopefully there's some insights I might be able to provide.
Great. Well, Pedro here. I am a senior data engineer at HelloFresh, and I've been working, like I would say, mostly my career around data. And I fell in love when I saw the concept of the data mesh, and I think I have been probably one of the persons pushing it like bottom up most in all of the company I have worked since the company I got in touch with the concept. So this is cool because I'm really close to the implementation part, and like going to this show don't tell approach, and then people start seeing the value. So I hope that perspective is useful.
Mm-hmm. And Pedro was on the HelloFresh's meetup a couple of weeks back as well, which was a great thing. So I recommend people check that out as well. So so quickly, what is the agenda? Going to go through kind of what is the data product definition re data mesh, because people are still somewhat kind of asking this question of what does this actually mean? Like what there are some words on the page from what Zhamak has put out, but like, what does this actually transform into? Kind of the three architectural components of a data product in data mesh, the input port, the output port, and that middle bit. And we'll talk about those little things, or not little things, but of how they roll up into a full data product. And then a non-exhaustive list of the non-architectural components, concerns of a data product. What we don't want to do is super overwhelm you, just talk at you or anything like that. But we also want to make this more approachable so that you feel like you can actually build a data product or get started on what you would want to do around this going forward. So we'll start with a quick definition from Juanes in the community as well. So he sent this over. A data product is a collection of data sets concerning a certain topic which has risen to fulfill a certain purpose, yet which can support multiple purposes or be used as a building block for multiple other data products. So a couple of quick little things within this. A certain topic, so that's kind of your bounded context. That's where you're talking about, you don't throw all of your data into one data product. That's basically the data lake. And then this thing of it can support multiple purposes. This is something where there are some people who think a little differently on this, but whether you should be creating a single use case type of data product, or whether that gets you into kind of the same kind of concept of what's been happening with single use pipelines and things like that. And then, the concept as well of a building block for other data products as to, the data product itself can be a collection of data from the operational side or from other data products and combining all that data together. So it's a good way to kind of start from the definitional standpoint.
I would refine that definition. Is it too early? I'll shut up.
No, I mean, it's fine if you've got something that you think is useful to add there.
My only thing is just at the start, we talk about collection of data sets. That could be interpreted as a bucket, like an S3 bucket or something of like collection of data sets. But I think the product is more about, it's curated, right? It's consumable. Like it's not just a bunch of, because otherwise you could interpret that as like when we talk about data domains where like there's a bunch of data assets, but they're not consumable. They're just assets brought in one place, right? So maybe there's something about a consumable thing. I don't know what the right term is, but you know, it's got to be consumable, right? Like the whole API thing, the discoverability, it's got to be consumable.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, you've got to. There's something in here about data user experience and ducks, and you know how that's a real thing. So, so I'm gonna quickly go over this. This is from Jamak's logical architecture, or the data mesh principles and logical architecture. So this is like the literal specific thing that she wrote about, but. So I had asked Pedro about kind of what he thinks about scope of a data product, and kind of breaking it down in this same framework. What does this specifically look like? So the code, it's the independently deployable code. So we'll talk about this of kind of the boundaries of what's in the data product and what's out, right? And so it's bringing in that necessary data, it's producing the data that will actually be consumed, right? So it's transforming that. Your transformation logic is within the data product. There's the CI/CD process and that as well, and version control, and it's really important that data products are easily reproducible, because if not, then you're putting way too much effort back onto the data producer, and people aren't going to be bought in. So there's both sides of that. There's the infrastructure side from the platform side of making it so that it is easy to do these things. There's the data itself, and then there's the metadata as well that kind of comes around that. And that data can be in a lot of different ways. And again, it's not necessarily a single table. There may be data products where it is a single table, but for the vast majority of the way you're thinking about this, it should be, again, going back to Wannis's definition of multi-purpose. If you've got a single use data product, it's going to be like what happens in a lot of companies with microservices, where their microservices are a little too micro, and you end up with 30,000 of these things or whatever, and that just doesn't help anybody, right? We have to make this stuff discoverable, and so putting it up under a single broader definition of what's going to be in here is important. So, so with that, I would like to get Pedro and Mohammed's view on kind of what do you think about scope and things like that. Like how big should a data product be of this microservices, services, macro services kind of concept? And, do you have a feeling for what's a good number of data products under a domain? I mean, I know this stuff evolves and it's different for each one, but, and the genesis of a data product is, should this be that it is the purpose-built thing that then you add to and you continue to add to that? Or should this be on the domain to say, I think that my people, or I think that consumers will want X, and so it's all based on that producer to create that, and also how, again, with the evolution, how do you measure what's being used and eliminate cruft so that you don't end up with these bloated data products, especially if like maintaining the quality around these three tables is difficult, but nobody's using those three tables. So how do we get that out of there? And I know these are a lot of questions and stuff, but just like if you've got thoughts on these things, would love to hear kind of what you two are thinking on this.
Pedro, why don't you go first?
Yeah, please go first. I'm still
Okay.
figuring it.
We'll just play ping pong.
Well, yeah, I
No
mean,
problem.
just pick one or two of the
Yeah.
questions that you think are interesting, and feel free to answer that.
I think for me it's manageability, and that's a reflection of your maturity. So like if this is new, your domain being the business people, they don't know what a data product is, and they're not used to being responsible for that. And the whole idea of them kind of owning data and having to make decisions about it's all new to them. So I'd really start off with just, in a domain, just starting off with one product until the sort of governance and other mechanisms mature to a level where, people understand what they're managing and what they're responsible for, etc. And architecturally, you can always make things more and more microservice based as you evolve, right? So maybe it just makes sense to start off by just saying, within a domain. So I remember one of the customers we worked with, they were central government, so they were talking about Citizen, and they were saying that Citizen is a product, right? And everyone who's building an app needs to be able to access the Citizen data product to understand who a citizen is or whatever, right? And there's so many ways you could carve that down. But really, they just started by saying that the basic data product is a basic set of information about age, last interaction, all that sort of stuff. And you just kind of grow from there. So I think a lot of this stuff is really just about recognizing that the whole concept is new to people. So keep one product for a domain to begin with until people understand what that means, and keep that product architecturally manageable, and don't overcomplicate it, because obviously it's going to mature and you might decide to make it smaller and smaller over time. So just have a look at the size of your team and have a look at the size of, whether people understand what it is you're building, and kind of, but I don't know if that's a non-answer, but
Well, no, I mean,
it's kind of like just start practically and with what you can manage and kind of go from there.
well, and so it is, you're talking about the evolution of decomposing it, right? Like rather than you need to start with a super small purpose-built type thing and add to it, you're saying that especially as you're learning, start start a little bit bigger and maybe not have as strong of quality SLAs, but that people still can understand what the quality SLA starts with.
Yeah, so like to take the Citizen product, it's that you query with an API and it says to you, this is who this guy is and their details and maybe who they live with. And you might decide later on to break that up and make it more granular and allow people to access different parts of it. But your starting version of it is, who am I building this for today? And they want 10 or 12 bits of information about the citizen in the schema that gets returned when somebody queries the product, right? And that's fine to start off with. And as we go forward, we'll decide that actually let's make it more granular, let's make it more smaller, because the requests keep changing. The likelihood is that your first set of products aren't going to have that many users, because people are still going to be discovering what to do with it. So just kind of accept that it's going to be a journey, right?
Yeah.
You're going to make it more and more gradual as you go on.
I can also, like, when you're talking like about the genesis of a data product, my sense is like producer versus consumer. Sometimes at the beginning is the same producer is the first consumer, right? And probably thinking about like, like let's say I'm a payment application, so I really care about like how people is going through the payments. I need to be able to analyze how payment is going. So I need to start collecting data about the payment performance to be able to even improve my product, right? So this is the beginning of the concept that, I need to start thinking about analytics of my own product to start using it. So let's say the data product should be in their domain. I would say yes. And especially because you are the first consumer, you want to make like, like initially we have a product or some application, then we start collecting data and we're running analytics, and then we start creating like informed features, right? Let's say once it's analytic, it's stable, we can start using the same analytical value to improve the product itself. So in payments, the classic one is fraud detection, right? Because I already know what a fraudulent payment looks like. I can use like by similarity, and I can use my own data to improve my product, right? So like the first consumer and the first cycle of a value of data starts in the same domain.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think that's great. And the next slide is going to kind of contradict exactly what we talked about, but this is somebody that's a little bit more further along in these types of things. So this was from a Delivery Hero presentation, and you can kind of ignore the middle bit. But they've got 11 BUs, 174 data sets, and 5.2K tables. So this is as they're bringing more and more domains on and they're getting their feet underneath them and kind of decomposing and adding additional things. They've got what accounts to about 16 data products per domain. And, it's different for each domain, obviously. And then about 30 tables per data product. So a little bit what we talked about earlier of, not having this single use, that you really try and make everything purpose built versus like, let's tee people up for these, for being able to really dig into this information, like the fraud detection and stuff like that. There's a single use for that, but there's also multiple interesting additional uses for what's going on there. So Zhamak talks about this concept of an architectural quantum of data mesh. So, Neil Ford in this, where I'm going to drop the slides so people can get to it, but this presentation by Neil, I mean, it's phenomenal, but it still kind of blows my mind. But of like, he updated his definition of what an architectural quantum is and stuff. And, there are lots of different ways to interpret this, but basically at the core of this, a data product is the smallest thing that we can deploy that is essentially independent of anything else we deploy. Obviously it's got to have the data that comes in for it to be useful, but you can still deploy a data product even if it doesn't have any data. So, so it is that it's not really super reliant on anything else. There's obviously some reliance and things like that. And again, the platform should help you to deploy that data product, but the data product in and of itself is independent of other things. So, it does mean that it's larger than a microservice because there's multiple things in there, right? There's multiple pipelines, there's multiple transformations, you're getting data from multiple different sources. But it's and I really do recommend watching this webinar by Neil Ford from ThoughtWorks. So
do you know with HelloFresh, do you think their first iteration of any even one product was as sophisticated as pipelines and or maybe the first iteration of their products was just tables that were sort of just made available to users, right?
Yeah, I would say like even the first iteration were spreadsheets. Yeah.
Yeah.
the first
just a network drive.
Yeah, it was really just spreadsheets. But you started like, this is when you measure the value, right? So if you say, oh, this spreadsheet is becoming like too useful and people want to refresh it over time, let's prepare a proper table and actually start building on top of it, because like it's the same concept of fail fast, right? Start testing concepts quickly and get feedback.
But as part of that the data product has that production side as well. So when you were talking about that table, if there's data that's flowing into that's part of the pipeline or what, you know what I mean? Like it's, and so, but I fully agree with you that we don't need to overcomplicate things, especially once people are getting used to these concepts. If you've got full buy-in from everybody in the org, which no one has, like it's just not a thing, but then you can start to really iterate very quickly around building like very, very reliable, type of data products versus like, hey, we want to test how people consume things. So data product basically has these three architectural components. And I'm going to use an absolutely awful analogy because, but the input port is your mouth. That middle bit is your digestive tract. That's the whole thing of transforming and, prepping and all that stuff. And then we won't talk about what the next thing is, but why it really fits is that middle bit is really the complicated parts, right? That is where you're going to end up focusing a lot of your initial time around how this works, but it ends up being, if you have a vision of what you want people to be able to consume, then you're going to end up with probably not spending as much time in that middle bit. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. But so the input port is how your data product gets its data initially, right? So it's getting data that's coming in, and it is crossing the boundary of the data product. So it can be batch or it can stream, it can be push or pull. I'm going to make a recommendation from my side, and what I've talked to people about is that it should be pull. It should not be push, because that push can break much more easily. And especially if you're crossing domain boundaries, like if a domain owns their data product, then they should also own how it's flowing into that and stuff, but you can still break it pretty easily. Many data products have multiple input ports, so you think about pulling data from a whole lot of different systems and things like that. But well, and I'll show you a thing in a second, but and the input port itself, when I say it's managed by the data product owner, it's like that they own the fact that they need to own getting the data in, right? They need to own, because it is within the boundary of the data product itself. So they need to own that this is functioning. Now, if they're doing something like an API call, obviously they're not necessarily owning that API, or if they're pulling data from another data product, they're not owning the output port from that data product, but they do own that it is, if the other stuff is functioning correctly, that it is able to get this data into the data product itself. So there's a good
couple of interesting points on that, just really quickly. You talked about push. I just go back to, so if you talk about push and pull, it's hard to see how your product would be an independent architectural quantum if it's push, right? Because it means somebody else is responsible for pushing data into your product, right? Whereas actually part of your product is all of its capabilities, including what it does to get the data it needs, is just part of the product, right? So I'd imagine that you'd always have a pull model, because otherwise your product is not an independent quantum that kind of does everything it needs for itself. I don't know, like Pedro or Scott, whether you disagree with that, but I imagine it's always going to be some kind of pull model, isn't it?
Yeah, like most of the time, you just need to be aware of what are your sources. So like the product, you are actually, let's say, gathering your sources. So in this case, like you're pulling for it. So yeah, I would say like it's really hard to think about like a push one. I think more of them will be some sort of pull, probably, real time stream or batch mode. But yeah, I feel like it's more like a pull mindset.
So I think pull is the way you should go for reliability. But I think if you're talking about initial data product or things like that, that push may be what you end up having to deal with. But I agree that push should never really be when you're going down that path down. If you're trying to actually,
I
have something
suppose
that's reliable and deployable. And
if the source of the data was another product, then push means that the product before is pushing into your product, right?
Right,
which is weird, because I would expect your output port is there not to run by itself, but to be queried by someone who wants to consume it, right? So
there can be data dumps, and it could be that it's like that there's a batch process that puts stuff into your bucket, so that you're not pushing it into a bucket that then your data product goes and pulls from that bucket, right? Like things like that, where it's just doing a data dump into your own bucket, and that's the cross thing. So it could be, but yes, I agree. So data product, this is just a good kind of understanding of what this kind of looks like. So you've got your input ports, and you've got your output ports. So in this example, something is able to be consumed as a Kafka stream, or just accessing the bucket, and we'll talk about that in a second here. So so an input port, in an ideal world, you should only ever have two potential sources of data. And this is my personal opinion, I mean, happy to be corrected on this, but in an ideal world, it should be a data store run by that data product's own domain, because again, it is controlled by that domain. So there's there's a commitment to not kind of breaking those, and that there's communication of changes and things like that, and another data product, right? Because that has specific SLAs and things around it. how you do external data sources and things like that. Do you need a service to prep and clean that before you pull that in via an input port? I'm not clear on that, honestly. But in the real world, that's not at all the case, right? You're going to have data stores or other things that are run by other domains that don't necessarily have that SLA. So you've got to kind of figure out how you're doing that, and you want to try and negotiate with that domain or whatever to be pulling. If you're pulling data from their operational database, how are you doing that? Hopefully you're consuming something like a Kafka stream or CDC stream or whatever, but that you're not disrupting from that when you're doing pulling. But how are you doing that is important, and understanding that this is the ideal of what a data mesh looks like is not going to be what's real, right? Especially as you're getting going. What are types of input ports? It can be an API, it can be a stream, you're a subscriber on a pub sub, it can be a batch push, it can be that you're just going and grabbing from a bucket and it's not even an API. There's all sorts of different ways that can work. And then an important note about your data, and this is something that Zhamak has talked about, and I'm still trying to grok what might be a thing to violate this, but I agree with her that there should not be any transformation of the data before it crosses into the data product plane, because if you're trying to do a specific transformation of the data before it comes into the data product itself, you are having again, a pipeline. You're having a single use thing that is much more prone to breaking, and that you may have 15 or 20 of these things rather than, and so it's again the question of, is this a quantum, because is this independent, because it's dependent on that data being transformed appropriately before it gets in. And then there's also a lot of reasons why you might want that raw data. If there was a data quality issue, where can I flow up and down the pipeline? Did I lose some context around things as it's coming in? I think that this is up for debate, but this is something that's been, it really helped me to understand that, like, you really want this stuff self-contained within the data product, because then you control it, right? Otherwise you're at the mercy of somebody else's data quality. So do you have what?
This probably touches on, so one thing we did was there were people out there building lots of different products, and so we created like architectural standards. So we said that, look, a product to be a product has to follow at a top level a certain pattern of staging, ingest, etc. And you probably need to do that. So you'll have some kind of design authority or something laying down some standard architectural patterns for a product, in which you will say every product has to have a staging layer in which data is landed raw without transformation or something like that, right? So you need to kind of specify that. And again, you don't have to have those governance forums and decision-making structures on day one. You can just start by building products that are a little bit messy and a little bit unhinged, but it's something you need to do eventually, is put some top-level standardization or design principles around your products. Probably very, very important.
And there was in the chat, there was a little bit
I think also it's important.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was about to talk about that, especially. Like, I think there was around a bit of discussion about the push and pull semantics, right? And I think people is thinking about events. And I think, like, think about products, right? So if my product pushes data to you, means that I am basically doing a request to you. So I have like a synchronous link. So basically that means that you are part of my pipeline or not, right? So I think, like, we don't want to have this synchronous coupling between products. We can probably have some sort of asynchronous coupling, right? So in this case, I push an event to an event bus, Kafka, topic, whatever, and then you react to that event, right? So in this case, the pulling part goes on you, on the second data product. Again, it's like we want to avoid some sort of like a synchronous hard coupling instead of like asynchronous coupling.
Right, and that to me, you, by subscribing, you are pulling in that data, right? Because that is an active thing of you are the one that are the subscriber. You are a passive, you are passively pulling in the data, but you are still making that decision rather than somebody, directing something directly into you. But I do think there's some funny batch things that push, especially to start, might be, especially just pushing data into your bucket so that you don't, I kind of hate this concept of, this output of whatever gets pushed into a specific bucket, and then you go and grab that data from that bucket for no real reason other than that bucket is just a second landing area. And so like, that's the one where I'm like, but that can get pretty squirrely too. So, so output ports is how the people are actually consuming the data or data products or whatever, right? Data products have multiple output ports in a lot of instances. It can be, via an API call. You can have, just SQL access. It can be CSV. There's all sorts of, Kafka stream, all sorts of fun things like that. Structured, unstructured event streams. I think Pedro, you mentioned about like graph stuff as well, and what we're kind of having this debate a little bit in the Slack right now as well. Of there are some people who are trying to say that the data product extends into kind of not just how people are able to consume the data itself, but their actual end consumption. So into the BI dashboard or the tool or whatever. From my perspective, I don't think that makes sense, because I think that becomes too much on the data product owner, and you are, it's almost like you're saying, you've got mac and cheese. You're not going home with them and cooking the mac and cheese for them, right? You're packaging up the box so that they can do what needs to be done at home, but you're not doing it for them, because that gets to be way too much. And there's all the whole thing about how dashboards aren't reused and things like that. So then are you saying this is officially the way you should look at this data, versus this is the data that we have and we want you to do this, to be capable of doing this analysis? So and then you can have additional information that is available at that output port. It's a little squirrely where output port versus kind of the metadata stuff ends up being, we'll get into that a little bit later, but I'm still trying to grok that myself. So I don't know if and then I think we're going to head into a question break here, just so, but what is not in the scope of this discussion is for a lot of data products, there's a standardization across your data products for your output ports, right? So that people don't have to create, or don't have to learn how to deal with every single data product in and of itself. Not really in the scope of this discussion. That gets kind of crazy. So, and we're not going to go into super specific examples unless either of you two have that. I don't have anything necessarily in the slides to go into a specific example. So like, the broad question of how do you think about your data ports, your input ports, and your output ports? Like, we talked already, I think we already covered push versus pull, that you want to pull as much as you can. And how do you tie things up to that upstream system, right? If something isn't necessarily broadcasting via an API, how do you work with that upstream system to get that data? And how do you detect your upstream changes and things like that, so that you're monitoring that kind of data quality as to when it's coming in, and or do you, or and then how should people think about designing their output ports, and just broadly any pitfalls? Pedro, do you want to go first, or are you?
Yes, I can go first.
We're making Mohammed go first every time, so.
No, yeah, I can go first on this one. I think like really put yourself on I think initially, normally this is the first part, like people want to see a report, right? So probably a report is backed by a table if you have, let's say, relational type of request. at the same time, oh, I need a stream because I need to do something in real time, then you expose it in real time first. So I think actually the output port is probably the easiest thing to know, because normally this is what people would request to you. So how to design them like properly, like, like really try to understand what is the use case that will serve most of the people, right? Because you can probably say, yes, if I give you this as a table and I try to make it discoverable and interoperable, like probably more than one domain will get benefit, or more than one stakeholder will get benefit. So I think that part is important. And also it's like, it's funny because you can present the same data, but in multiple ways, right? I can expose the exact same data in historical fashion and stream fashion. And it would really be useful for, like, for example, machine learning models. So it's exactly the same data, exactly in the same format, just in two different, let's say, presentation formats, let's say. So really, like, this go to the use case. And I would say, like, always start simple. Probably the table is the simplest, and probably something like in a batch mode, it's also the simplest way to start working on it. And like the need will arise, like consumers will tell you that we need faster, or we need like real time.
I like that of don't try and put too much into it. Don't try and be a hero up front. Wait for the use case to come to you and those requests. And especially if you have a high empathy org where that communication flow can work, then you can actually extract that information from people too, right? Where they'll come to you, or you don't have to go and say, what do you want? What do you want? What do you want? They'll come to you and say, this is a request and not a demand, and go that way. So Mohammed, do you have?
I think just really quickly, we talked about like the general preference for pull, which I think kind of covers the first 2 points there, which is definitely you want your product to be independently monitorable. So like my data didn't turn up, it didn't refresh. Why is that? And that sort of model just makes it easier to go, oh, it's because my job didn't run, as opposed to having to go and sort of find out what sort of happened upstream. Because you want to make sure that what your product is supposed to do is monitorable by you, as in you can kind of easily get to the bottom of kind of what went wrong essentially. And I think in terms of the upstream system, so we talked about this where we talked about schema registries. So we talked about how if you have a product upstream, you're supposed to register it somewhere. And there was a question, I think, in the chat around metadata and being able to query an API to get metadata out of the product, and also making the metadata of a product available in some kind of registry where somebody can go and see it, right? And that's really important to be able to see, oh, okay, there's been a schema version change, for example, in some product upstream. And that, maybe I could be a subscriber to that list. And so when someone updates that registry, you could do it in Confluence and just kind of give people like, oh, okay, there's been a new version of this product that might affect me next month or something, right? So you're going to kind of create that mechanism. And we also talked a lot about backwards compatibility. So the idea that if you change a schema, there's different types of schema changes that get registered to say, this will break you downstream because we've removed something, as opposed to we've just added something into that schema. So you kind of shouldn't be affected. So again, it comes back to that process of like notifying people, which kind of gets a bit interesting as you get, I guess, more and more complicated. I think the other thing I'd just quickly say is I think you have a lot more flexibility on the input side than the output side. Because I think on the input side, you're going to lay down some specification to say, don't mess around with your data, keep it raw, whatever. But because it's kind of within your product, I think you have a lot more flexibility of it. I think output ports are the things you really have to be quite militant about to make sure that, they meet a certain standard, as there's a certain kind of like number of them, and saying, every product has to have an API to get the data and an API to get metadata about the product, for example, right?
Yeah.
That might be a good standard to lay down, for example. So I think you've got to be quite militant on the output side, I would say.
And kind of what you talked about as well of if you've got kind of proper upstream, downstream tracking, and I guess I shouldn't say proper, but pretty advanced, somebody who is looking to change that data product should be able to, when they're working in their branch, they should be able to see who would this affect, or have an idea of, especially downstream data products that are consuming that data product of, I'm changing this, and that you can alert them well ahead of time, not just I pushed a change that's going to break, but you can tell them, I'm going to push a change that may break. Let's talk about this, and that there's timing and people can understand.
So we did that through product contracts, but you can only have a contract with a person that you've consciously agreed the contract with, right? So it's like, are your products just there for someone to walk along and consume, or can people only consume your product if you've given them permission to consume your product, in which case you go, oh, what's your requirement for this? Right? So like, how would you actually be in that place where you knew all the time who's consuming your product, you know?
Well, but if you have good tracking of who has consumed it, right? Like that should be something that you're tracking. And so you have an idea, and you may not know exactly what they're consuming it for, but somebody who is new that is coming up and finding your data product, not necessarily that they would have to care about what happened, what came before, because you can't break the thing that they haven't put in place. So, and then so Trey Hicks at Glue had been nice enough to provide this for us, as well as to what is a little bit of an example of what their data product looks like, or one of their data products, and it's for their organization data domain. And they've got an event stream port here, they've got a REST port, and then they've got just a file port for CSV that people can export. And they've got their thinking around this as well of and I'm still trying to grok exactly this, keep the application dependencies and use cases out of the product. But I think that's kind of what we talked about of like single use versus like, we want to create this in a way that people can consume it, and that it's not necessarily that the person that is creating the data product may have a opinion of the way it should be used, or it might be used, but you also want to create it in such a way that it's still multi-purpose enough that somebody could come along in a novel fashion and do it, right? That they've got that kind of ability to do that. So the middle bit, which was kind of, everything else outside of, getting the data in and enabling people to access the data from there. That middle bit, I think it actually ends up being a lot more simple than people think about, because it's just taking the data in and prepping it for how you're going to have it be consumed, right? So it feels like there's a whole lot here, and there can be, because there can be multiple pipelines, it can be, all sorts of different transformation logic, and it can be, the actual production of the end data that's going to be consumed, and then it's moving it to the places where it's going to be stored and served from. If you're serving it from multiple different places or product types or anything like that. This was something JP Morgan was talking about on their meetup, is that a lot of their data products are served out of multiple different places, multiple different stores. And so, but it's really just that kind of transformation logic within there. And again, we didn't really cover exactly how data product and the data platform interact, but these pipelines and things like this, the data product team, the data product owner needs to create the code around doing these transformations and things like that. But the actual infrastructure part should be enabled to be, by the platform side. So that way you're not having people that, you're not having a developer that has to learn how to create, these different pipelines and, oh, okay, well, for this one, I want to use Flink, and this one I want to use Spark Streaming, and for this one, I want to use Pulsar, and this one I want to use Kafka or whatever, right? Like that you're not making it so that they have to learn how to do all those things. But as a platform team also, if you're offering up that many things to them, maybe rethink that you don't need to offer up every tool to everyone for every use case. But it does seem like I've simplified this too much. So if either of the two of you have something, I think we've got question break coming up in a second. But a data product is similar to a set of microservices, because it's not just a single thing that is doing a single thing, because it's not a single bit of our infrastructure or code that's doing a single piece because you are creating a broader data product, right? If you have very, very small data products, maybe you might have a single pipeline that's doing the transformations or whatever, but really it's typically much larger than a general microservice. And I know this kind of feels like this is the advice of, how to draw an owl, draw 2 circles and then draw the rest of the damn owl. But it kind of is very, very dependent on what you're trying to produce as an end product, right? Like and what do you need to actually produce that? And then how do you work with your platform team to make that easily reproducible? So here's again, Zhamak's logical architecture of a data product. So like breaking it down, the code for data pipelines when you're consuming input port, right? The transforming is middle bit, serving upstream data, depending on if you're actually talking about serving it out, that's going to be the output port. But if you're talking about serving it to other parts of the data product itself, then that's middle bit. But, and I just tried to break this down, and I apologize if anybody is colorblind. I'll try and, when I put the slides, I'll put some notes in here as to what's coded to what. And then we've got a bunch of stuff that's kind of assigned to other, that's not necessarily the architecture of the actual data product, but it's all the things that come around that, right? Or what I think of non-architectural components. So the data product production, and I think we're going to, Mohammad, I think you have to drop in 10 minutes, correct? As well. So I'm going to be, you're on mute still.
Says seven.
Okay. So, want to get through this a little bit, and then we'll open it up for broad Q&A once we go through a couple of non-architectural components. But, what are the things that you think about with data product production? How do you apply this CI/CD to data and data products, because they're kind of 2 different things of, the reliability and reproducibility and all that stuff around data, as well as the data product in and of itself. And what do you think are the biggest pain points that somebody who's going to create a data product has to look to, or what are some recommendations you have there? And how do you team up with that data platform team? So Pedro, Mohammad,
Pedro, I suspect you might be a little bit closer to the platform side of things than me, but
Yes.
yeah, I was going to say the biggest pain points for data product producers, I think just the immaturity of the services that are available to them. I mean, you talk about, like when Zhamak talks about the 3 levels of the platform, right? The having a good developer experience plane, and there's a maturity curve for that for sure, and it's a big learning for a lot of platform teams. So I think the biggest pain point I saw was just the practicalities of getting access to the right platform and the right services and being able to use them easily and kind of all that sort of stuff. So I think just the sort of developer experience and that the platform kind of currently supports is probably the big challenge there.
Yeah. Also, I think like one thing that I see happening a lot is probably how to approach testing, right? Because you have too many things that are dependent, like, how do you create data that is meaningful, close to production, but you cannot copy production data because it's still like too large sometimes. So I think like, how do you approach your testing, your development, how you make your components? Like think like a proper, like my background is from electronics. So I usually think about circuits, right? So you have a signal that is moving and there are components interacting and modifying the signal, right? So if you can actually make a graph and actually look how things are being modified in these components, it's a very easy way to understand. And then you just think about input output, right? So each of one of these components is having an input and an output. So once you can get like isolation for this component, testing becomes easier, right? But sometimes you see people having like a large chunks of SQL or having like large chunks of processing that it's really hard to test with too many inputs, and it becomes very tricky. So I would say like approaching testing and design, it has been like one way to start having this CI/CD process, because it's different, right? You can imagine like it's creating a Docker image and putting a Kubernetes is easy. When you have a distributed system like Spark, right, or Hadoop, you start adding more and more complexity.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So I think, Mohammed, I think we're probably gonna drop at some point. You're gonna drop relatively soon. So I just want to be cognizant of that. So I want to say thank you for everything. And this has been great, and looking forward to doing more with you on these going forward. But Pedro and I will soldier on in your absence. So non-architectural components concerns, this is a non-exhaustive list, right? Because what I don't want is people to say, okay, so I've got to do these 800 things when I'm creating a data product. Some of this stuff, we're trying to figure out how we communicate with the community as to what's good enough to get going, and what's, as you kind of evolve and do that thing. So one that I'm really focused on is DUX, is the data user experience. Data quality, metadata documentation. There's a lot of things that if we were talking at you for 2 hours, we could dive into, but I don't want that necessarily to be the case. So Zhamak's list of what a data product must be. It must be discoverable, understandable, addressable, secure, interoperable, trustworthy, natively accessible, and valuable on its own. So this is something to just think about. Am I hitting these specific kind of things? So data user experience. In data product thinking means UX matters, right? If you just have data products, that might not be that you actually think about who is consuming it, because a lot of times what people think of as a data product, not inside the data mesh, but in general, it's to specifically back another product or something like that. And so there isn't a user experience, but people are consuming your data. So there is a UX, right? There's documentation. You can have sample notebooks. You think about your schema design. You have well-documented policies and lineage and SLAs and usable output ports. One thing that I'm going to be trying to work with people on is creating, I haven't fully named it, but I think I'm going to name it Data Moss, which is Data Mesh OSS. So it'll just be like a general project of Data Moss. And somebody unfortunately owns datamoss.com. So I was like, so I might just do .org or whatever. But that we can start to open source some of this stuff, and that people who have their notebooks can open source their sample notebooks with some dummy data and some documentation, so people can get an idea of what this really feels like and looks like. Adevinta put out a great blog post on this where they talked about 2 sample notebooks for every data product. They've got a beginner and an advanced notebook, and that has like some logical queries or some queries that the data product creator, data product owner and team would think would be useful for people. And then an advanced one that's more for like data scientists, and that, might be more about like the raw formats and things like that. But I like that kind of concept of thinking about how can somebody actually consume this. And then the Intuit way, Intuit in their blog post, they talk about, and I've been calling it that. They haven't been calling it that. So, don't think that they've got too much of a big head around that. But I don't want people to give Tristan crap. But they have a set of questions that they went and asked a bunch of people internally. So like, go and talk to your consumers, right? We talked about kind of putting something out there and seeing what comes back, but also go and talk to them and say, like, what would be useful for you to solve? I do this kind of with community stuff of, I've got ideas around what people might want to do, but as well, it's like, what do you want to achieve? What, like, okay, you want to create content, but do you want that so that it's, is it purely altruistic, or do you want to do it so that way you can be known more in the community, or do you want to do that? And all that stuff is fine with me, whatever people want. I think both Pedro and Mohammed are very giving of this and are very much about like, I just want to help people kind of thing. But if somebody wants to be famous, that's fine too, right? It's that same concept of going and saying, and then I adjust what the opportunities I put in front of them relative to what they want. It's that same kind of concept with a data product, going and actually talking to these people. And there isn't data product management, data product marketing internally yet as a concept. but this will evolve and emerge of like, how do you go and you actually talk to these people? And so Intuit has a great set of questions. So, and then, you know, an important note around ducks, documentation is crucial. You must have documentation. It is required. That is not up for discussion. I'm sorry, but words don't tell a complete story, right? Like I write horrible documentation. I don't understand how other people talk. Highly neuroatypical. But like, so like showing people what they might want to do. This is very much an early emerging discipline. I'm the only person that I know of that's talking about ducks. And again, I just keep trying to brand it that so that way I can make bad puns. But I think it's something that really, really matters when you're talking about where we're going with data mesh and those consumers. And then, you know, data quality, want to put this together as well. Like, how do you actually deal with data quality and what does this all look like? Again, I'm going to post these slides up here so people can kind of read through all this stuff. But, you know, having that quality process so people can trust your data, right? People will need to trust your data product. That's required, right? For it to actually be a useful data product. So how can they trust it? How far and things like that. Metadata and documentation. I don't really have a ton of opinions here because I haven't thought deeply around this, but like, how do you do this? And that it's, again, it's not just documentation, but there's other metadata. And where does this live? Is this living with the data product? Is this living with the, you know, just at the catalog level? What metadata do you need? Is it about the data product itself, the version, things like that? So Mohammed, I know you got to drop, so just.
No, I can stay for still 15 minutes, but I suppose one question is kind of how much documentation do you need outside of your metadata? Because you're obviously going to have metadata, which is going to explain the product, its purpose, who owns it, blah, blah, blah. What else do you need to document about it that you couldn't serve up as metadata and therefore kind of just keep within the product? You know, make it easy that way.
Right, and well, and I think for me, I'm still trying to figure out if we've got the tools yet to be able to do this, but like talking to people, they want to put as much of their documentation, metadata, all that stuff in the code, so it lives with the data product itself. So you're making a schema change, you make that documentation change, you make that metadata change about that stuff in the code, so that way you're not having, you know, 15 different panes that people have to go and, okay, I'm going to update it in Confluence and I'm going to update it in the specific data catalog and I'm going to do it here. You know, it's the data platform team and things need to have that empathy angle of, I want to make this so that when people are making changes and things like that, when they're talking about this stuff, they don't have to go and remember to paste it in 15 different places, right? You know, so that breaking change happens and people can figure out where it is, you know, that consumer can figure out where it is and it's in the data catalog, but it's not that data product owner had to go and make sure that everything is updated for every little change. So I agree with you. And I just don't know the answer around what metadata is necessary. I'm just not there.
Yeah, I have like, you know, I really value metadata, and I think like you can build empires on metadata only, right? If you think about PageRank is an algorithm that basically built Google. Basically, Google was built on top of PageRank, and it's addressing pages by the metadata, right? By other links, not by the content of the page. Now it's way different, but at the beginning that was the breaking through, right? So you can imagine in this case, you can build a full company just based on metadata, right? So I think like when you get this mindset, that actually like checking the links, checking the importance of metadata, and like probably sometimes the managing metadata is more complex than managing the data itself, but you can actually like unlock a lot of value. So, you know, thinking about discoverability, thinking about like how do you link different products, right? Which products are related, probably tagging systems, or probably like checking, like trying to address these links. You know, like I totally agree with like the example case. We are using a data catalog, And these data catalogs most of the time comes with APIs. So we also try to say, like, let's try to keep the configuration and the metadata close to the code and just like let the CI/CD process talk to the catalog via APIs. And we don't need to like manage too many things in different places. And these data catalogs now are having like social features, right? So people can rate your definitions. So, you know, like you're saying this column contains the country name, but actually contains like an ISO code of the country, not the country name. So people can say, I don't like this definition, and you get like rating and feedback from users. At the same time, people can also like follow your table. So whenever you post an update, like, be careful, we're going to release version 2, and we're going to deprecate the old version in 1 week. So people can actually get a notification in their email, inbox. And they say, you are notified, you are aware because you are really interested because, I don't know, I built a dashboard based on this data product. And another thing of these social aspects that you should really be leveraging like modern catalogs is like you can also post questions. So it's like, normally you will have Slacks, right? And people like coming to the team and asking a bunch of questions. So by centralizing that into the catalog, you can actually create dynamically your FAQ, right? Your frequent asked questions. And then like everything is living there and people can help and support each other. So I think like moving toward that kind of mindset, like being more social, involving different people, just like, digital products are evolving at the moment, right? Like, there is a lot of like social aspect into it. So let's bring exactly the same mindset to a data product.
Yeah.
Which modern catalogs are you using that have all these cool features?
We're not using probably not a super modern one. We're using Informatica, right? So,
I didn't know Informatica had social features. Fair enough.
They have this, yes. They have a data catalog. You can post questions and you can also make announcements. So basically people will follow you. Basically they just get an announcement. But I think that if you check like Amundsen, they have also similar this kind of like social features. I'm not sure about Marquise, but I think like I have heard a lot of good things about it. So, but I think this is something that people is discovering, like, this social feature or this like, crowdsourcing of metadata, it's a valuable thing.
There was a great post actually by Bar Moses, I think, or somebody at Monte Carlo about moving from cataloging to discovery, right?
Yeah.
And the idea that you shouldn't, the old kind of data management thing of get someone to go and update a catalog. It's like, no, your service, your developer experience plane should have that sort of automated discovery of, oh, something's changed here. And so again, that's part of the design of this that goes outside of the product you're building and is more of a concern for your platform team. And so again, it's a question you've got to kind of raise with them is our first iteration of the platform and developer experience. What does that contain? What's the maturity path,
Yeah. Well, and I'll plug one thing here for something that's upcoming. We haven't announced the date because we were still figuring it out, but we're going to do a panel on data discoverability specifically. And so there's going to be some folks that are doing a lot of those products that you were talking about and other ones in that kind of space, but that we're going to have like an actual panel on that as a topic as to like what is necessary, how do you do it, all that fun stuff. So but yeah, and there was one question in general, please do throw questions into the Q&A if you want us to address them rather than into the chat. But there was one question in the chat that I wanted to address because I think the answer is you don't. So there's Marco asked about what about federated queries over multiple interoperable data products. And I don't think maybe you do that at the platform level, that the platform team focuses on that, but I think that's a third or fourth tier concern. I think you talk about there are specifications as to how you store data so that it can be interoperable, and that you are working towards interoperable output ports so people can consume data in the same way and that it's easy, but that you don't have a query necessarily that can go and hit a bunch of data products unless that person who's creating that query has done that to make those multiple API calls. So you have that harmonization capability of the way the data is stored should have, you don't want to say some standardization, but that there's some specs internally, some specifications, so that people can adhere to them to make it so that your data can be harmonized and interoperable, but that you don't necessarily put everybody into the same box of here's your schema and this is the only way that we do that, because that again gets into the same issues that we've had around scalability and agility, but that there isn't necessarily something where somebody can easily do that out of the box, at least in your first, 12 to 18 months of data mesh, unless there is this is something where I need to do that. And so you might think about that as a data product of multiple API calls, pulling that together. And so, or somebody writing some GraphQL to pull those different calls together to put that data into one thing. That's just my thoughts around it. Again, I'm not super deep on that, but I don't know if you have thoughts around that as well.
I think I can mention refer to the HelloFresh presentation, right? Like, especially my part was around experimentation. And you can imagine that we need to assess the success of an experiment, right? And you are pulling metrics for different domains, actually. So experiment as a domain is an aggregated domain. So actually we pull data from different domains and we aggregate it to create a new domain, right? So to make an experiment analysis. So if you think in this way and you have this need like to be federating and getting data from different sources, different data products, so probably you are having this case, like an aggregated domain that actually requires to come from different domains. So it's worthy to actually investigate if you really want to create this new domain, because if this is this need, like you're getting data from too many sources and you need to process all the time, what is the value that is happening out of there, right? I think people is not just like querying and joining everything against everything out of nowhere, right? They have a purpose, and probably you need to create a specialized data product to serve that purpose. And yes, the input will be like you have multiple input ports. And when in the talk, I mentioned that we're expecting to have like infinite metrics, right? In the future, we're trying to scale to have like infinite. So we create data ports or input ports that can be configurable. But basically, people can self-onboard their input port. So this kind of mindset can also happen, right? So you need literally to address if actually you are dealing with a new domain and bootstrap that domain.
Yeah. So if I'm interpreting what you're saying as well, is that you need to be able to enable this capability if it's something that you need to do constantly. But if you're talking about a one-off query, you're kind of SOL, right? You're shoot out of luck, I guess, if we want to be, friendly on the language side. But like what we're talking about is that if you're trying to do ad hoc querying, that type of stuff, you've got to do the harmonization and stuff yourself, but you should be able to get that data, right? That's the whole point of data products, is you should be able to get to it and get that data and do that harmonization yourself. And that you want to set it up as a company where you've got those specifications around that. Intuit talked about how they've got, one specification for event storage. And if anybody wants to go and use a different specification, that is fine, but they actually own that specification. If other teams start using it and it picks up an adoption, then it gets moved into central governance and that team gets a nice pat on the back that they created something that other people are using. But it's that kind of thing of, we want to make it interoperable, but we also don't want to put people into a box necessarily that they can't offer that value up. So yeah, no, I think that's great. Mohammed, did you have?
I'm going to have to drop, but yeah. I can answer a question if you want, but if there's nothing, then I'm going to have to leave you guys too.
Yeah, well, we're going to jump into the Q&A now, but or the actual Q&A that people are asking in, but I don't want to hold you. I know you got family time and stuff you got to jump to, so.
Yeah, okay. All right, cool. Okay,
Thank you so much for your time.
I mean, if there's anything anyone wants to ask, you can always just post it to the Slack, mention me, mention Pedro, or whatever, we can pick it up too. Yeah. Right. Cheers, guys. Much appreciated.
Thanks. Pedro, do you have another, couple of minutes? We've only got 2 questions in the chat, so I think we can kind of jump through these or in the Q&A, if that's good.
Yeah, I'm not in a rush.
So Mohammed asks, at what level the RBAC should be applied for a data product? Is it upfront or downstream inside the data product? So, I mean, unfortunately, Mohammed just left, but I'll talk up one thing he posted about, which was specifically that you bring your governance with the data product, right? That the data product owner should be thinking about that governance, and that governance needs to be enabled by the platform team and things like that. but that you think about that. But the other thing with RBAC is that it gets a little confusing because inside data mesh orgs, as people are, as you're evolving as an overall org, your role titles are changing and your specific roles are changing. So you might have 50 different people doing that thing. So I would love to hear kind of how you've done it and how that's worked.
Talking a little bit about like how do you apply controls and access.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think like we are trying to basically specify like you want to move towards data democratization, right? So what you really need to protect is like private data, which is like this is within the law. And then you want to enable discoverability based on your catalog, right? So actually we want people to discover data and we want to enable these kind of things, but we want still to protect data and have this access control. So I would say like we have public by default, right? If you don't have any private data, and on request, right? And basically you will get nominal acceptance to private data.
Okay, I think that's great. And then Adam had asked, regarding the API port, how do you ensure that the API isn't serving an undue amount of consumer business logic? For instance, the consumer may request substantial SQL transformations of the data, putting undue load on the data product producer. The style of service data product seems very familiar to the dependency scaling problems in synchronous microservices. So I guess from my perspective, when you go to a data product, you're not actually asking the consumer isn't asking the data product necessarily to do that transformational logic. There may be, specific gating and things like that, but you're bringing tooling to that data product to do that transformation logic. So the data product itself is there from a consumer perspective to serve. It is there to serve the data. You tell it what data you want. And then if you're doing those transformation logic, you've already done the transformations to put the data into its tables or its format or whatever. And then you've got an ability to consume what you want of the data that is there. And if you want further transformation, you've brought a tool to do that. Is that like, that's my kind of naive understanding of it? Is that how you're thinking about it as well? Or is that how you do it?
Yes, I would basically say like, who is requesting this transformation is basically the consumer, right? Because probably the consumer has a very specific use case, right? So in this case, probably you say, I'm taking care of the generic use case, right? And you have enough tools to actually serve your needs. So basically, probably like we were selling like a pooling approach. The transformation could be the pooling query or the pooling thing regarding to this one. So also we talk about a little bit like the multimodal, right? So it's like, okay, probably there is a very specific use case. I even mentioned like graph, that it's a very specific, serving like a very specific need, but it's so useful for us and so required that we decided, okay, we expose that in a different kind of API, right? So you really need to balance like value, right? Because if there is a lot of value and you are actually the expert on doing that, do it. But if not, you are still enabling your consumer to get what they need from that data.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And yeah, I think that's kind of where I come down as well on that of you want to tee up so people can do what they need to do, but you don't need to necessarily shoot ahead or whatever, where you're going to anticipate the way that everybody's going to want that data. You make it so that they can consume it and do those transformations. And there's an interesting concept in data mesh that we're seeing of people bringing tooling to the data and doing, rather than you make a copy and you pull it into your thing, you're bringing the tooling to it and it's ingesting into your Spark or your SQL or whatever platform you've got, and it's ingesting into that and you're doing your transformations there. So that way we're not having shadow copy issues and things like that as well. So, well, this has been super awesome. Thank you so much, Pedro. Thank you, Mohammad, as well, for spending the time here. Hopefully this was useful for people. I know I learned a lot and hopefully other people did too. But if people want to give feedback as to whether they want these types of things as well. In general, most of our meetups are people presenting their use case, like Pedro did, 3 weeks ago. But that is this something that people want to have these types of things as well, and whether people want them to be live or whether they want just kind of chat panels, things like that, because we want to make sure that we're creating content that's useful for the community and that helps people kind of advance. So, and people have feedback, or if they need anything, or if they've got follow-up questions, I'm in the Slack. Pedro, are you typically in the Slack, or
Yeah,
how do people?
I check it, I would say 1 time per week, but for sure, feel free to ping me and I will reply.
Okay, I didn't know if people follow you on LinkedIn and stuff like that. I'll post your LinkedIn thing in the YouTube, and we'll upload this to that soon. So, well, thank you, everybody. This has been awesome. Look forward to talking with most of you in the
Thanks
Slack
a
soon.
lot.
All right, thanks.